Why I Am No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Eddo-Lodge. I can only really preface this book by saying it is clearly by someone who is very much in their own bubble of postmodernism, and I do think that is the best way to describe it. And I'll explain why later, but first I'll explain who Eddo-Lodge is. According to the book, she is a London-based award-winning journalist. She has written for The New York Times, The Voice, Daily Telegraph, Guardian, Independent, Stylist, The Pool, Dazed and Confused, and The New Humanist, which is a host of lefty mainstream media, article-based sites and newspapers. Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race is her first book, and it shows. It was chosen as Foyle's Non-Fiction Book of the Year and Blackwell's Non-Fiction Book of the Year, long-listed for the Baillie Gifford Prize and shortlisted for the Books on My Bag Readers Award for Non-Fiction. So it's won a few awards, and the only reason I can think that they won awards is because of how controversial the damn book is. Because if you are just going to preface on the cover anyway that you don't want to talk to a specific race about something, that's going to cause a lot of controversy, which it did. Remy prefaces her book with a preface in which she copy and pastes a blog post she made in 2014. It's essentially a blog post trying to put a lot of the blame for problems in the world on white people, and also say that whenever she tries to bring up racism, that white people get really defensive. And she doesn't seem to realise that in some of the examples, she seems really, really antagonistic towards white people, and that's why they get defensive. So say white people cause slavery, like obviously white people are going to bring up how slavery is everywhere in the world and how black people own slaves, etc., etc. And then she says, oh, this is just them trying to make us self-censor, which isn't the case. They are just trying to make the case that if you try and pin all bad things on white people, you're going to make a caricature of some devil-type figure that is a white person. And so she said in the end, I don't want to talk to white people about race anymore because they bring up unfortunate facts that I can't be bothered delving into. She only really does, throughout this book, go through facts that support her own side, and that's made really obvious in later chapters. But for the rest of the preface, she explains how basically racial lines really dictated the response to that blog post. Basically, white people were astonished that she could say something like that and claimed reverse racism, even though it's just called racism. And anyone who wasn't white generally told her that this is exactly how I feel. Oh my god, I can't believe you've put into words what I was thinking. Which, I mean, she's London-based, so I imagine this is quite a bubble, because who reads blog posts by London-based journalists? It's going to be other London-based journalists, I imagine. So that's probably part of the reason that she got that response. She then mentions later on that she wrote this book specifically to carry on the conversation of race, even though she said she's not going to talk about it to white people anymore. But this isn't really talking to white people about it, because to be honest, she's just preaching, really. This is a preachy book. And that's made really bloody obvious by the first chapter. So the first chapter is just the history of racism, basically, and it starts off with her being at university and finding out that the British Empire was involved in the slave trade, which anyone with any sense of history knows. Slavery was a worldwide trade, and it was a very bad one. That's why we got rid of it. And it's about 10 pages of just piffling on about how black people were mistreated in the past. There is one line where she almost seems self-aware and says they traded them from the African elites, without any type of criticism on the Africans, and it's all on the English. It's like, how could the English buy any type of slaves? It's like, well, why would the black people sell their slaves? But she just seemed to just say all these black chattel were at the hands of the white man, which they were after they were traded, but they were traded in the first place by the black people. And then it goes on to say how in later history, say in the Victorian times, black people were second-class citizens, which is true. Until then again, we got rid of that and realised everyone should be treated as an individual. She doesn't seem to realise that morality is an ongoing process and that we get our values from the ongoing culture that is constantly criticised and changed, and that's why you need freedom of speech, by the way. But she seems to just ignore this. But she does point out that history seems to be only there for people that truly want to understand it, because it's not very well taught in British schools nowadays, because we learn about the diet of a 19th century aristocrat or something, which is just of absolute no importance. Or we find out that Nelson cheated on his wife sometimes, but we don't actually learn anything about the empire. And she does point that out, and I agree with her that that's a pretty bad thing. But it's mostly just pointing out racism in our history, and it does seem to be that the further in the future she gets, the more individualistic the racism gets. So it goes from slavery, which was applied to every black person, more or less, to then some individuals, well, say in the late 1800s or early 20th century, say a black person wanted a job, they'd say there's no vacancies, but if he was white, they wouldn't say that. Like, that's all totally true, and that's all totally like fine to like put in a race relations act, which we ended up doing. Which I'm amazed she didn't actually mention Enoch Powell in this speech, but that's for later. But then she says something really weird that I actually had to go double check and turned out to be absolute crap. She said that the word mugging came about in the 50s and 60s and was specifically used for when black men rob people. Now, I'm from the north, so I went to ask my grandma this, and she said, has mugging always like been a word? And she was born in the 30s, and she's like, as far as she was aware, yes. Mugging was just like, say, you were riding a bicycle and someone came along, knocked you off it, and robbed your wallet or something. That would be a mugging. It's just a violent, thuggish act. But she seems to say that, this was just applied to black people, and it's like, maybe in the South, and that she said it came from America, and that's not true either, because it comes from a Nordic word. So she just outright lies in some places as well. And how this gets a book of a year with misinformation is beyond me, but as I said, it's just because it's controversial. But that basically sums up the first chapter. Bit of misinformation, not too much to be fair, it's mostly true. More anecdotal evidence the further into the future you get, and the fact that this apparently seems to be irredeemable for white people. So unlucky. Chapter 2 is about the system. Basically, the system is currently discriminatory against black people, and she uses the issue from 1993 where Stephen Lawrence was murdered by a couple of white men, and it took about over a decade to get the man actually arrested and put in prison, which is a complete failing on the system of the police. And she says that this is because of white people being racist, which there was, as far as I'm aware, and she doesn't even say there was any evidence for, the evidence is apparently self-evident in the fact that they were dealing with a black man and didn't do it as well as they should. But that could be for any number of reasons. I mean, is racism in there? Might be a bit, but I don't think it was primarily. Because I don't think, well, as it's been proven, the British police are completely anti-racist, and there was a big old 10,000 word summary or something on how the British police will go out of their way to be as anti-racist as possible as to stand any chance of having a career in the police force still. But, you know, because Stephen Lawrence died and there was one case of one black man not getting served justice straight away because of police incompetence, yeah, apparently that's the whole system being racist. But, well, it's according to an ideologue, so what can we do? She tries to point out that racism isn't explicit, so say you don't just say the N-word while committing a crime and then it's racist. But what she extrapolates from that is that basically then means that any attack on a black person from a white person is racist, or basically a white person to anyone else, because she does use the power plus prejudice line to mean racism, therefore only white people can be racist, which is where the whole reverse racism thing comes from, and she just says, that's not a thing, don't try and make that a thing. Which I agree, it's not. It's just basic racism. But throughout this chapter, she basically uses an anecdote of a imaginary black person and extrapolates from statistics basically what a black person can expect from life. And she claims very little, apparently. She says, from a place where she can write openly about this, be openly racist, to be quite honest, in this book, and write for all these great newspapers. But apparently, because that doesn't happen to everyone, that means the system's racist. So she'll just go through statistics saying 70% of professors in British universities are white men, without really going any further. This whole chapter is just bringing up statistics and explaining that it's racist through self-evident means, which is circular logic and doesn't work. But that's what this whole chapter is based on. And she'll go a bit on immigration, like, basically native British people are favoured a lot more, it seems, throughout, the British institutions than foreigners, which, makes sense to me. The only exception is the NHS, but that's because we're in desperate need of nurses. Just, it is a mental chapter, and it was very, very difficult to get through for me. I wouldn't recommend reading it, because I think if you have any experience with people like this, you know exactly what they're going to say. She does make it very clear throughout it, though, that it isn't. It basically seems to be a type of subconscious racism. That's not how she puts it, but it's not like it's out of a place of evil or malice. It's basically just compliance with what is basically seems what she seems to think is British tradition. But British tradition isn't really racist, because we got rid of slavery, and sure there are examples of racism in individual areas of British institutions, but those people are gotten rid of so quickly you can barely say the system's racist, can you? But well, Remy says it is, and in the end, she says basically she understands that this has to be won over by individuals on an individual basis. She does seem to understand the power of the individual, and then she criticises colour blindness. So basically, from my perspective, if she gets the perspective of it in this book, she basically does say, look, colour blindness is not seeing colour. Which basically, she does understand that it means I'm not going to judge someone based on their skin, and she said that's the wrong way to go about it. The only way to be like entrenched racism or whatever is to openly talk about it. And she understands why that can make people uncomfortable, but it's basically everyone else has to change to fit her worldview, and you really get that at the end of that chapter when she just outright says colourblindness is the wrong way to do this. To change a structure, you have to openly talk about racism in the structure, without realising that if you make the structure not judge anyone on race, then it's going to eventually not have any type of racism in it. She unironically thinks you have to judge people on race to not be racist. That is insane, but, well, that's the end of the second chapter. The next chapter, which you need an entire chapter on this, apparently, because the system wasn't good enough, but it's called What is White Privilege? And she starts off by basically saying, everywhere in England that I see, in the media, in fiction, whatever, they're seen as white. And so I asked my mother when I was going to be white, and her mum said, you're never going to be white because you're mixed race. And she took that very badly. She then goes on to say that racism is confused with prejudice, and is sometimes used interchangeably. That's probably because it's the definition. And this is where she puts the prejudice plus power equals racism, and if you don't have power, it's called reverse racism, which, again, I disagree with. It's all just racism. You just need prejudice to be racist. And to be honest, if you've spent any time looking into the realm of social justice, you're going to know exactly what this chapter has said. And to be honest, you're going to know what the whole book's going to say, but it was still interesting to read, to be quite honest, just so I can get a full understanding of what they were actually trying to say. So I'll give the book that. It makes sense what it's actually trying to say, and it's bloody horrible. But she does what she does in every other chapter, bring up statistics where white people are clearly outdoing black people, say in Parliament, and say, oh, this is racism. And she even mentions that Diane Abbott, being one of the few black MPs, whenever she says something, I quote here, says something very much outside the realm of white agreeableness, then she gets hit with rockets. Then she praised the price for rocking the boat. That's word for word what is said. And that is mental, because Diane Abbott rocks the boat by being obscenely stupid, not by being black. She also brings up the fact that it seems in the media, if something happens in a quote-unquote white country, it gets a lot more airtime than, say, people in India or Bangladesh who aren't white. Without realising that the reason for this is that we have better relations with what happen to be white countries than we do with them. But the thing is, she doesn't mention that when, say, a volcano erupted in Montserrat between 1995 and 1999, that got a lot of news coverage because, the British Navy had to go in and save a load of black people, but there's no mention of that, obviously. It's not like we protect British colonies and British citizens outside of the UK and the white spaces. It's completely ignored the anti-racism Britain has in this book, and it's really annoying because it's clearly just from a left-wing black supremacy. Oh, not black supremacy. Let's be fair here, but it's an anti-white perspective anyway. That much is very clear. There's then some talk about safe spaces and how black people need their own safe space, and that she even quotes things that I totally agree with. So safe spaces is a direct corollary of the rise of identity politics, which is fucking true. But there's not even like a backlash to this in a book. She just says, "Oh, they're wrong. Like, we need a safe space." That's all she basically says. And it's like, "Oh, these white people are clearly out of touch with the black people," which is constantly poked at throughout the book, and it's ridiculous. And she even goes on to say, like, when people quote her Martin King's "I Had a Dream," which is basically an advocation of colourblindness, she then says, "Oh, but Martin Luther King also said this, that basically white moderates are the worst thing for the black man because they don't actually stand up for them," which is true, don't get me wrong, but that doesn't mean that you then get white people to agree with everything you say, because you might be wrong on those places. But she's totally bloody uneducated on that type of thing, this woman is. She's just a journalist who did a liberal arts degree, and it's absolutely ruined her. I mean, I think people are right when they say that neo-marxism and post-modernism mixed together have just made a really bad state of affairs where there's just mental gymnastics throughout this book. It was really hard to read, but at least I have a better understanding of it. There's then a small conversation with one of Remy's friends who she calls Jessica, who is mixed race. And basically, she doesn't really talk to a black side of her family because there's a lot of domestic abuse there, so she's mainly with the white side. And whenever she brings up the subject of her race, it basically seems like they just dismiss her, and she can't understand why. And I think she doesn't understand why because they've never told her, if you act like a victim because of your race, you're not going to get anywhere in the world. Maybe the family doesn't really understand why she's got an issue with her race. I mean, that's actually outright said. But I think it's important to address from the family. But it is just weird how she is basically just saying, I'm clearly a victim because I'm part black. The white people don't understand. The white part of my family don't understand. And the thing is, why would they? And two, they don't think so because they think everyone thinks like them. Well, like, if they're totally acceptable of being in a mixed race relationship and having mixed race kids, then that's totally fine. So they're going to think that a lot of people seem to act like them because it doesn't seem like they really got a lot of hounding for being a mixed race couple. So why would they think that the system is racist? But this Jessica seems to just assert that it is, and it's just mental. And then it seems to be like, if you're going to have mixed race kids, be ready to like bring them up as mixed race kids and not just as any other child, which is just mental. This whole book is just advocating for seeing race, and it makes me really uncomfortable because it really puts you in a me versus them attitude in terms of race. It's just collectivism, and it's fucking horrific, as I keep saying. This chapter is ended with talking to a white person called Jenny, who basically says, I understand that, people like Remy have problems with racism in a way where normal people don't have an issue with racism. And she basically says, I do what I can to avoid activist spaces because she basically says in a roundabout way she's not welcome there, but she seems to try and put it in a way that says, I know I shouldn't be welcome there because I am white. And it's really uncomfortable to me that you'd think that way. But an even more dangerous precedent is set by Remy in the paragraph after. Quote, when I write about white people in this book, I don't mean every individual white person. I mean whiteness as a political ideology. A school of thought that favours whiteness at the expense of those who aren't. To me it is like yin and yang. Racism legacy does not exist without purpose. It brings with it not just a disempowerment for those affected by it, but an empowerment by those who are not. That is white privilege. Racism bolsters white people's life chances. It affords an unearned power. It is designed to maintain a quiet dominance. And I think that really sets the tone for the rest of the book. If you start thinking that there is political ideology behind whiteness, and I'll explain that whiteness is never explained in this book. It's just assumed. It's assumed knowledge. It's assumed knowledge wherever it is written. And it is a scary prospect, because you cannot start saying that a skin colour is a political ideology, because that is putting politics into everything and everywhere where it is not supposed to be. And if you start making policy on that, You're going to have some type of supremacy somewhere, I can tell you that. Chapter 4 is Fear of a Black Planet, and really does lead on from the last bit of the last chapter about whiteness being an ideology. This is where Enoch Powell is mentioned, and I do have a video on Enoch Powell's speech, and I think it was along racial lines when it shouldn't have been, basically. That's how I'd sum it up. It should have been about integration of cultures, which he was kind of aiming at, but because it was mainly down racial lines between the cultures, it was hard to, like, split between culture and race back then, which is totally understandable, I think. But now we realise that races can integrate with what seems to be whiteness, according to Remy here and a lot of the postmodernists. So she goes on about how, like, immigration is scaring people, like, oh, it's going to get rid of the whiteness, which, again, it's like she is stuck in the 80s with 80s, what am I talking about, 60s with Enoch Powell, where, like, culture is down racial lines, which it just isn't. And it isn't because well, there's more diversity within a group of people than there is between groups of people. So obviously you can get people who integrate better than others, you know, etc., etc. And so after going on about immigration and why it's why white people are scared of it because of the race involved, instead of the fact that it's going to completely change the face of a country, which she just totally ignores, or which, no, she doesn't ignore, but she takes as changing the face means changing the racial makeup, which isn't really anyone's problem unless your generation identity, or the high Tories in a way. No, people generally don't care about that. They care about the fact that it's going to be a totally different culture that, I mean, is inferior to in the eyes of those people. It's the same reason why anywhere that gets a mass influx of people, they fight against it. It was like every British colony, basically. But in this chapter, she talks to Nick Griffin, and I really don't like Nick Griffin, but she seemed to ask him questions where he could make good points. I do want to point out Nick Griffin is also talking along racial lines, which I totally disagree with. It's along cultural lines. But the question asked, do you think that by Britain accommodating differences, people from different races and cultures at the time, is akin to erasing white Britishness? And he answers in small numbers, no. But that is the aim, and it's the inevitable result of large numbers, yes. Which is, again, along racial lines, I don't really give a shit about that argument. Along cultural lines, absolutely yes, I agree with Nick Griffin. But these two are talking in whiteness and blackness as if they're political ideologies. Well, no, Nick Griffin isn't. Nick Griffin is talking Britishness, but in a white sense of Britishness, as in, he does talk about mixed race couples and having a policy against it, which I totally disagree with. So that's why I say that. But he's not. I wouldn't say he's anti-black. I'd say he's definitely racist, isn't he? He wants Britain to be white, and I think that's wrong, basically. But then he's asked by Remy. Her parents are from a Nigerian background. She's from an ex-Commonwealth country. What should she do? And Nick Griffin basically says, you're quite young, so get out of the country, have kids close to your own heritage, because Britain is utterly fucked. I don't agree. I think you should stay and try to change the country. I think you should try and make it more liberal and stop trying to look along racist lines. But, I mean, honestly, she did just get, like, the worst person you could imagine say, this is like the ideal whiteness, and then interview him. Without really mentioning that, like, no one voted for BNP since they went on Question Time in, like, when was it, 2013 or something. She then says, these people then move on to places like UKIP and stuff like that, and it's just mental, really. It is just trying to find any excuse she can to be a anti-white bigot, basically. She then makes the argument about the Cecil Rhodes statue, and she's like, basically, the black protesters were saying Cecil Rhodes was a racist, and a reply was, we don't want him erased from history books, which is a poor way of saying what they're actually trying to say. And she mentions that as well. She's like, we're not Tipp-Exing him out of history, we just don't want him celebrated. But having a statue up isn't necessarily celebrating someone, it's showing a step in, say, Oxford University's foundations towards what Oxford University is today. And if you're Tipp-Exing that out, that's basically denying the fact that you've come away from the racist man of Cecil Rhodes to your great institution today, which is overtly non-racist. Although you would say it's racist because only 10% of black students get into Oxford or whatever it was, which is apparently racist according to these people. But oh god, she then goes on about freedom of speech because she thinks that it's for power and that people who fight for freedom of speech don't ever want to be criticised for their speech, which isn't the case at all. They just don't want people kicked off platforms, which she doesn't even mention, by the way. She just says, freedom of speech isn't a debate, it's just so one person can say everything they want without being refuted. People don't mind being refuted at all, but there's no mention of that. She just says, it's just an excuse for people to try and continually be racist and offensive. And it's like, well, yeah, because that comes under freedom of speech law. I'm going to quote this. Let's be honest. We have to have the guts to unpick who gets to speak, where, and why. Oh my god. The real test of this country's perimeters of freedom of speech will be found if or when a person can freely discuss racism without being subjected to intellectually dishonest attempts to undermine their arguments. No, it isn't. Freedom of speech is that you can say anything you want within the public domain, politically I should say, and not have any type of bloody legal consequence for it, or financial consequence for it. The consequences should only be social and what other people are going to refute to you. They can be as intellectually dishonest as they want. Because who defines what intellectual dishonesty is? The answer is no one. There could be agreement on it, but you can't have an arbiter of speech, can you? That's just a mental thing to say, and that's part of whiteness, apparently, is to dismantle Rennie's arguments in what she calls intellectually dishonest ways, and it's mental. She then makes the attempt to say that no one is criticising right-wingers like Katie Hopkins calling refugees cockroaches. In fact, no, what she says is we need a cultural commentator that advocates for true compassion and total open borders. As if people don't bloody do that. Honestly, in the past year there must have been about 5 Guardian articles advocating for open borders. That is mental, but her excuse will be, they're not advocating open borders for the right reasons, which is just mental to me, as if there's any good reason to have an open border. This is really underhanded tactics to try and say that basically I should be able to say what I want without refutation, but no one who is an advocate for free speech says that. They just want an open and honest debate, and if people want to be dishonest in a debate, they don't last very long as debaters. Which is probably why I've never seen Rennie on Question Time, let's say. But what do I know? I do find it ironic how in this chapter at the end she mentions why are white people so afraid of being minorities in their own country, when throughout the chapter of history she went on about white colonisation and how it made massive problems for the native people of other lands. It's a classic case of doublethink, I think, where she just says, where it's one rule for me and another for thee when it comes to demographics and what you can complain about. But I mean, I do want to say at this point, I don't think she's a bad person. I think she's just really, really ideologically narrow in her mind, and she can't really see the other side of these arguments. And if she does, she basically does just call them racist. I'll be honest. That was the whole point in 3 of the chapters. But I'll carry on. The 5th chapter is the Feminism Question, and I'm not going to spend too long on this because, to be honest, it's basically every argument she has made in the past 4 chapters all applied specifically to feminism, and then she goes on about intersectionality. Basically, you can't just split up your experience as a woman and your experience as a race, they're intertwined. Some bollocks like that anyway, which, I mean, I guess in some ways it can be true, being a woman and black can disadvantage you in some ways, if you run into a racist who is actually genuinely a misogynist, you'll get treated worse than a black man, let's say, because at least you can respect him for being a man. But I mean, really, it's just not relevant. I mean, being treated as a woman in the Western world, according to Rennie, is you're in a lot better position than being black anything, which basically just explains the progressive stack, really. there's not really too much more to say on that other than previous feminism hasn't been good enough, but third wave is very good because it's intersectional. Oh, and it's trying to cause a lot of problems for the men. She doesn't say that, but that's just a general commentary on it. But that's all there's really to say about that chapter. It's 30 pages of waffle about the same arguments represented again in intersectional feminism. And honestly, if you've made it this far through the video, you'll know what intersectionality is, and I can't be bothered really going through her explanation of it because it's just a lot more long-winded than mine. But she does say one thing in this chapter that really, really got to me, and that was about scandals in Rotherham and things like that. She basically tried to make the claim that no one cares about a rape or systematic rape unless it's committed against a white woman, and she uses, and if it's committed by someone who's not white, then it will make a lot bigger and a lot bigger backlash than if it was, say, a black woman being raped by Muslim men. But no, that's not the reason at all, Rennie. They are fed up with the police being overtly anti-racist because of your rhetoric, that they have gone against everything they are supposed to do by protecting people having their rights infringed upon by being systematically raped. But you can't see your problems in your own philosophy, can you? That's the problem. That's the main problem with this book. It comes up with no solutions, just says everything's bad, tear it down, I can do a better job. She's the arbiter of truth, she thinks, throughout this book, and it is the worst part of this book that really got to me. Someone gets raped, she doesn't care because white people care about it. That's basically what I got from that. Really got to me, but the rest of it's just stupid. So, again, I don't think she's evil. I think she's just stupid. But that's all I've got to say on that chapter. Chapter 6 is race and class. This is probably her best example of institutionalised racism. I still don't think it's institutionalised racism. I think it's just a council getting quite greedy and wanting to attract rich people who happen to be white. But basically, she lived in Tottenham, in the poor black area, and she looked into why a load of nice houses were being built at the other side of Tottenham. She found out it was basically to try and attract a load of what seemed like what I guess were the footballers for Tottenham, who were obviously quite white and very, very rich. So she then blames that on racism, as you would, and then goes on to say that the working class is no longer a white man in a flat cap, it is a black woman pushing a pram, which is an assertion I can get behind if you live in Tottenham, but if you live anywhere else in England, then it doesn't quite work. And I think that's the problem with most of this book. It's very London-centric. A lot of her examples are from London, and assuming that most of the country is not white, which isn't true. And so she basically says, white working class they aren't disadvantaged compared to any other white person or working class black people, even though there are now a load of programs to try and get black people and other ethnic minorities onto courses that can really advantage them, and white people are just screwed on that. So, which is why I think if you're white and working class, you're in the most disadvantaged place. And of course, she doesn't bring up any statistics about why working class, about how they're advantaged. She just asserts it here. It's probably because the stats don't really help her there. She also complains that not enough council houses are being built, even though they are usually crap and don't advantage anyone. But basically, if you're black and working class, you don't do as well in school as other demographics, even though white working class people are at about the same level. I think they're probably worse, actually. But she does just go on about how being black and working class is terrible, which no one said it wasn't. And the councils are only allowing planning permissions for rich people to try and get more council tax. I don't think it's racism, I think it's greed. And I don't think she knows the difference. But that's the end of that chapter. The final chapter I do find quite disturbing. It's called There's No Justice, There's Just Us. And she basically starts by saying she gets asked by a black sixth former when the end point of racism is, and she basically says there isn't any within sight, not within a few generations, which I don't agree with. I think that's a load of bollocks. I do really think if you stop talking about racism, it stops becoming an issue. I mean, when's the last time anyone talked about left-handedness being a sin and anyone being oppressed for being left-handed, which did used to happen? I mean, it happened 50 years ago. Boom, a generation, nothing about left-handedness comes up anymore. So I do think it can be gone in a generation. I just think people have to be smart about it. And by being smart about it, I mean not letting race affect them in any way. But this whole chapter is basically saying let race affect you in every way you can to try and bring down what I see as as Bell Hooks says, the white hetero patriarchy, whatever she called it. But man, she does just go on about how there's a bit of solidarity for when black people are affected, but white people when they're affected there's a load, it's things like that. It's like as black people we have to point this out. It's like we're not saying when you point this out to people, it kind of frames it in a way that's like, look, we understand that people who are closer to home are being affected by problems that can affect us one day, but these people who have completely different problems, live in a completely different world, and have problems that will never affect you, you have to empathise with them as well, and it's more of a have to, not we should probably empathise with them, which is a lot of what is in this book. A lot in this book is basically, we have to do this, that and the other, with no real reasoning behind it, just, there was racism in the past, I think there's still racism now, help me end it. Oh god, it's just horrible. She does understand that racism isn't overt anymore. She says it's all coded now, which basically says to me that racism is gone, but I want to use some mystical way to try and get power over people by convincing them in what can basically be described as original sin. Because she does mention that, we're saying white people are original sin. No, that's not what we're saying at all. And then goes on to basically say that anyway. I do just find it really, really insidious. And I can't get over how scary I find it. Because if that actually goes through and people actually start being convinced by it, because not too many people are convinced by it right now. But given how, J.K. Rowling recommended this book and, Emma Watson recommended this book saying, it's changed my life and how I look at race. I mean, they've got a big following. They could convince their following to change. Who knows where it can lead from there. But honestly, I don't think this book is worth reading. I think it's worth just having it summarised, which I basically have, and that is, this woman is a racist. She's very anti-white. She tries to have a moral impetus by claiming herself as a victim because she's black. And because of that, she thinks she needs to change the world and tear down everything that has made the modern world. And anyone with an ounce of sense knows that this is the type of person you do not put in any position of power. Any real position of power. Because she thinks that being white is a position of power, and it's not. And she thinks behind this position of power is a whole ideology, which there isn't. White people are so diverse in terms of their countries, it's unbelievable. And she seems to think they're all the same. But that's how I'm going to leave this review. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.